Goggles on now, here we go. Writer and broadcaster Charlie Connelly is here now for the Stamford's Travel Writers Festival with Julia Wheeler.
Hello and welcome to the Stamford's Travel Writers Festival. Thank you for coming with us on new routes to new places in a brand new way this year. We're absolutely delighted to have you along with us. Today we are talking to Charlie Connelly about his wonderful book, The Channel, which I have to say I've just completely loved curling up with and reading it, the stories within that, because Charlie, it's entertaining and informative, and your way of writing is just so engaging. So congratulations on it.
Wow, thanks, Julia. It was a lot of fun to write, actually. I kind of live next to the English Channel, so it was kind of a travel book that involved the least amount of travel I've ever had to do for a book, so it's kind of handy.
So, I mean, you've kind of immersed yourself metaphorically in the Channel in writing this book, but you actually immerse yourself literally, physically every morning, don't you?
I do, yeah. I've since I moved here about 4 years ago. I live in Deal on the coast of Kent, and in view of France, you can see France on clear mornings. I took it upon myself to kind of throw myself into the English Channel every morning. I'm not sure why I decided to do that. It was great in the summer. I think it was the first summer. I thought, wow, that looks inviting. I live next to the Channel. Might as well chuck myself in it. And I kind of carried on through the winters. So, I mean, we're where are we now? We're in January now, and I'm still at it now. And I've been doing it. This is my third winter swimming in the Channel, and I'm the biggest coward going, and I'm not a great swimmer. I can just about eke out a breaststroke, but for some reason I managed to keep going into the water every morning and swim. And at the moment the sea is it's just under 7 degrees, or it was this morning anyway, which is kind of chilly. But the hardest bit for me is actually taking off my cloak thing that I go down in the cold air. That's the hardest bit. But getting in the sea is easy after that in the winter. But yeah, it's kind of invigorating. It's fun. I go down round sunrise, so often I get to see the sun come up because we're facing east here. So the day kind of goes downhill after that, Julia. It's like when your day peaks before the sun comes up, it can be a bit of an issue.
Has it become a really important sort of ritual for you? And I imagine that if you don't get to do that one day, then your whole day is different, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I don't take any risks because I'm not I've got nothing to prove, not a macho guy, anything like that. It's not about being a tough guy. I just enjoy doing it. So some mornings I'll go down, if it's a bit rough and a bit windy, I'll opt out and I'll sit there and have a cup of tea or something. But I do enjoy that ritual. I think it's the ritual as much as anything else, especially the conditions we've been in for the last year or so, where movement is limited and we're all kind of confined to our barracks. So it's actually nice just to go, because I live right on the front, which is very lucky, really. So the sea is literally it's 100 yards that way at the moment. So that's where I do my exercise, and it's nice to see a horizon. Do you know what I mean? In these days when we're really confined and we can't really go anywhere, we're not looking further than about probably 50 feet in our everyday situations at the moment. So to be able to be in a position to go down and see a horizon, let alone kind of throw yourself in the water and swim towards it for a bit, been very, very fortunate. And it has become a really important ritual is the word for it. Yeah, it's become an important ritual of my day, and I go at least go down there 7 days a week. I'm not getting in every day if it's rough and rainy and windy and just a bit bleak, but most days I do go in, and you feel so much better for it. I mean, people say there's great mental health benefits, there's physical health benefits. I kind of just do it because I like it. If there's other benefits on top of that, then hats in the air. But yeah, I really enjoy it. It's I say I'm not a strong swimmer. I hadn't swum since I was at school before I moved here, so it's just a nice thing to do. And I'd reckon if anyone's in striking distance of the sea, do go and give it a go, even in winter, because it really makes you feel good for the rest of the day. Makes you feel calm. You get that kind of panicky feeling when you go in, and I've used swear words that I didn't even know I knew when I go in some mornings, but yeah, the sense of calm when you come out and you come back in the warm and you have a cup of tea and you have a hot shower, it really does set you up for the day. I can't recommend it enough, to be honest.
We'll come back later and talk about the people that go a little bit further out into the Channel and with a view to crossing it, but I want to just go back to the sort of natural history and the historical side, because there hasn't always been a channel, has there? Let alone an English channel. It came about because of an earthquake, I believe.
That was the thing that literally tipped it over the edge. Yeah, the Channel's probably one of the youngest seas in the world. I think the Channel as we know it today, it's probably barely 8,000 years old, which in the great timeline of the Earth is just about that much. Yeah, and it's very shallow at the eastern end, which is where I am. It's one of the shallowest seas in the world. Some parts of it's barely 100 feet deep, which makes the current race back and forth. But it did come about of the I can't remember the name of the incident, but there was a huge kind of landslip in what's now Scandinavia about 10,000 years ago that sent a big surge of water tumbling down through what is now the Channel, and it's quite porous, the rock there. I'm certainly no geologist, so there's probably, if any geologists are watching, they're probably just their moustaches are up and down at the moment, but it's quite porous and soft rock, so it didn't take much to push it through. And people used to live there on what's now the eastern angle of the Channel, the eastern end of the Channel. But people used to live there. I mean, the famous piece of land was what they called Doggerland, which was sort of between East Anglia and the Netherlands, and that sort of gradually sank and was inundated. And then what was left was this little isthmus. There's an isthmus join at each end, I don't know, but a stretch of land across between what's now Kent and the Pas de Calais was land for till very late, and it's that when there was this great inundation about 8,000 years ago, that's how we got the Channel, and it is very shallow, and it means the current is quite fast as well. When I go out swimming, the danger isn't being sucked out to sea, it's being ended up 200 yards down the beach from where you started, because with the Atlantic and the North Sea, tides are going at different times. One's filling and one's emptying, so the water's racing along the Channel, and because we're at this bottleneck at our end at the east, you get this kind of quite tasty current some mornings, and I fight against it when I'm swimming, and it's hard just to stay still. It's like a watery treadmill some mornings, but yeah, that's about as far as I go on the natural history. But yeah, the thing to remember is it's a young sea. It's probably one of the youngest seas in the world, so we've not been an island for that long.
And when did the Channel become the English Channel in our perception and other people's perception?
Relatively recently. I mean, the research I did for the book, it was only really a consensus of calling it the English Channel in the sort of early 19th century. Before that, you'd see English Channel used sometimes. Sometimes it'd be called the British Channel. On a 16th century Dutch map, it's called the Oceanus Britannicus, and there's another one that calls it the Oceanus Gallicus, which is the French Channel. But it's only the last couple of hundred years, really, that it's been defined, certainly by us, as the English Channel, which is a kind of pretty dull name, really. I mean, the French obviously do it much better, because they looked at it and they saw the shape of this thing and they said, it looks a bit like a sleeve. So they call it la manche, which is the French for sleeve, because when you look at the map, it does look like a big dangly sleeve. But obviously we looked at it and went, it's the English Channel, England, English Channel. Not very imaginative, but we've got to work with it now, because that seems to be what it's called.
Yeah, slightly territorial, which brings us on to the whole idea of the psyche that the Channel creates. And you say that, I mean, there is a symbolism there, isn't there? And I think, in school we're taught about the Armada and how actually it was the fact that we were an island, and the what happened in the Channel and the other seas around Britain that saved us and that sort of thing. But and you say that now thinking of it very much as a moat, but actually in the past it's been seen as a bridge.
Definitely. I think the situation we're in at the moment has been a battle between the people who see it as a moat and the people who see it as a connection, as a channel to the rest of the continent. It has psychologically, I was going to say affected, but maybe psychologically defined us as an island people. Anyway, perhaps more than it should have done, because like I say, France isn't that far away. I can look out the front window from the garden there and I can see France on a clear morning, and see it quite defined, especially in the afternoon when the sun's from the west and you can actually see the white cliffs of Calais, because we're not the only ones with white cliffs. Calais has the same. It's the same kind of chalk ridge that was inundated in that great infestation 8,500 years ago. But yeah, it does seem to have, there's a lot of mythology around our history with the Channel and our relationship with the Channel. There's the myth that we haven't been invaded since the Normans in 1066, which is patently untrue. There have been loads of invasions over the years. Most, the big one was what they call the, what do we call it? The 1688 golden, I can't remember what they call it now.
Glorious Revolution.
Glorious Revolution, that's the one. Yeah. Which was a Dutch invasion. Basically, they landed in Devon, I think it was, and the army marched all the way to London and took the throne. Which, if that's not an invasion, I don't know what is. But yeah, we do seem to have this kind of obsession with we haven't been invaded since 1066, and that's obviously defined by the Channel. And the Channel was probably, certainly historically, one of the most significant waterways in the world, certainly one of the busiest. It's one that's got a lot of the great historic stories, and it's all to do with preserving this image of us as the island as separate, when in the early years it was seen as a conduit between us and the Channel. And by early years I mean right back to the earliest crossings in the earliest human times, to medieval times. There was great trade between certainly the Bretons and the Cornish, and all the way through history. Really, it's been a connection rather than a division. But we seem to see it more as a division these days, and I kind of wish that was a little bit different.
It's interesting. There's a certain irony to the perception that we need to be protected from these invasions, when actually it's often been us going out there. You mentioned Calais. I mean, we should remember that Calais was British at one point, wasn't it?
It was for several hundred years, until the reign of Queen Mary, I think it was. Calais was part of England, certainly, and was it Queen Mary that died and said, Mary Tudor, that said Calais was engraved on her heart because it was lost under her rule. But yeah, it had English street names. It had a significant English population, and it maintained an English population for many years afterwards, but for slightly different reasons, which we might get onto. But yeah, I mean, and a lot of under Henry V, was it? A lot of northern France was part of Britain as well. But Calais was the last outpost of Britain in France, and it was an English town. You'd need documentation to get out of Calais into the rest of France, and all that kind of thing. And that kind of sums up for me this idea of the Channel as a conduit. That Calais wasn't thought particularly unusual that Calais was part of England or an English town, and it's a little bit different now, but it's been significant all through our history, whether we've had it or not, during the Second World War particularly, and the First World War when troops would go over, and it's always had that English flavour right up to sort of until the 90s, when you had the great big superstores, the wine where you get your cheap wine. The one was called EastEnders and that kind of thing. But so Calais has always had that English aspect, and particularly in the kind of 18th and 19th, early 19th centuries, when it was French again, but there was no extradition treaty between France and England then. So I think it was Philip Thicknesse in the 18th century called it the haven, the asylum of whores and rogues from England. Calais was known as, because people who were in debt and criminally in debt and facing prison for their debts would do a bunk over the Channel to Calais, because there was no extradition treaty, and they could stay in Calais and live in Calais very cheaply. It was a cheap place to live and escape their debts. So it was kind of these kind of English asylum seekers were heading over to Calais to escape their debts, and there were some very famous ones as well. Beau Brummel, the famous Regency dandy, he went bust and ended up in Calais for many years after that, in penury. And Emma Hamilton, Lord Nelson's, what do you call her? Lord Nelson's partner, I suppose you'd call her. There was that weird kind of triangular relationship with Hamilton, her husband and Nelson. But after Nelson's death at Trafalgar in 1805, he left provision in his will that Lady Hamilton should be looked after, which was kind of ignored because it was all a little bit embarrassing, that little relationship thing they had going. And she ended up spending her last years in terrible poverty in Calais because they wouldn't provide for her. And she had basically a pauper's funeral in the cemetery in Calais. She died an alcoholic and had really terrible last few years. And considering Nelson's one of our great heroes and she was the love of his life, I think that's a terrible state of affairs. But yeah, it was the kind of haven for the indebted, including people like Beau Brummel. And so it was the kind of asylum spot for British criminals. I suppose they were called criminals. They're escaping prison, for escaping debtors' prison, going over there. So we've got a lot to thank Calais for.
Yeah. I mean, your book crisscrosses the channel to towns on both sides. It's lovely. And while we're still in Calais, let's talk about the Burgers of Calais, because that is quite the story, isn't it? And particularly with relation to Rodin's sculpture, which is there, and you can sort of walk right up to it.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest pieces of public sculpture I think I've ever seen. Rodin's The Burgers of Calais. It's these 6 figures in various states of distress. Some are in these great kind of noble poses, and what they were, it was after the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Edward III was having a great time because he was defeating the French all over the place, and he decided to lay siege to Calais, and before he went home to England, and there was this really long, terrible siege. And he put out this message that if the 6 most important people in the town came out to meet him, they could negotiate the town's freedom in exchange for themselves. So the 6 kind of richest guys in Calais went out in kind of pauper's robes and had to plead for their lives and the lives of the town. And it was a pretty psychotic thing for a king to do. And they were supposed to be executed. And the Edward III's wife, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, pled for mercy, and they had nooses around their necks. And Rodan produced this incredible sculpture that's outside the town hall in Calais, which is also an incredible building. I mean, most people don't dally in Calais. It seems to be you go to Calais to go on somewhere else, and it was flattened in the war. There's not much great historic buildings left, but certainly the town hall in Calais is worth seeing, and you can see it as the ferry comes in and what have you. But outside the town hall, in the gardens, there are these beautifully kept gardens in front, is this incredible statue of 6 people, which Rodin cast in the, would it have been late 19th century, early 20th century, I can't remember exactly when. And originally it was going to be on a pedestal and fenced off, but Rodan was like, no, people need to get up close to this, and so that's what they've done. Fortunately, is this? I mean, it's really an incredible piece of public sculpture. These figures, they're all facing in different directions. Every angle, you can walk all the way around it. You can get right up close to it. From every angle, you can see these different emotions in each of them: the kind of regret, the anguish, the bravery, and it's one of those pieces of art that you look at it and you can see the story there. You don't really need to go and look at a board that tells you the story. You can see it all there. It's one of the bright spots of Calais. If you do ever go and visit the town, do go and see that, because it's really an incredible piece of sculpture.
Let's come back to this side of the channel, and you have a lovely time in Brighton. But the story that Brighton, as you say, it has a sort of reputation for eccentricity and so on. Let's talk about the Brighton Dipper. Who was she? What did she do? And why was she such a heroine in Brighton?
Her name was Martha Gunn, and I think of all the people I researched and the research I did for the book about the channel, I think there can't be anyone who spent more time actually in the channel than Martha Gunn. She was a Brighton Dipper, and what she did was when in the 18th century it was decided that sea bathing was great for your health and your general well-being, and they kind of prescribed drinking seawater as well, which was kind of Imagine that. That was supposed to be good for your health. It was supposed to purge you because it would do things to your insides that would purge you. But Martha Gunn had nothing to do with that. She was this terrific Brighton character, and they called her the Dipper. And there was quite well-to-do people could afford these kind of bathing carriages. And so what Martha Gunn would do, she'd be in the channel up to her chest, in the water off Brighton, off the beach, and these rich people would get in a bathing carriage because, you know, you couldn't be seen showing any kind of skin in polite society in those days. So you'd get in your carriage and horses would push it into the water and it would be pulled towards Martha Gunn. A door would open. If for the women bathers, which is what Martha dealt with, a curtain would be pulled round you and Martha would grab you. She'd dip you in the water up to your neck. And then she'd swing you around, and then she'd dunk your head under the water, and then help lift you back into the carriage, which was good for your health apparently. But she was a really, really well-known character. She appears in some of the political prints and cartoons of the time when, you know, we're always terrified here that the French are going to invade for no reason. And there was these great kind of political cartoons, sort of things that well, I can't remember the guy's name. Who's the famous cartoonist from the 18th century, the political one? His name's gone, but he had these ones of her defending Brighton. There were these invading French coming out of the water, and the people of Brighton are kind of there with their wooden spoons. And there's Martha Gunn at the front. She was this kind of short woman with about 15 layers of clothes on because she's in the channel all day. So she's as wide as she is tall, and she's there kind of shaking her fist at the French. And so she came to epitomise this kind of spirit of defence of Brighton. And she was a great celebrity of her day, but she lived kind of really humbly. She lived in the same house, which when I went to Brighton was a patisserie, but I think it's closed now. The house is still there, and there's a plaque on the wall just back from the seafront on one of the roads off the side there. And she lived till about 1815, I think it was, and she was in her late 80s when she died, and she'd been dipping since she was sort of 19 or 20. So she spent a good kind of 70 years in the channel. And when she died, the whole town turned out. And the Prince Regent, who went on to become George IV, who's the guy that kind of really put Brighton on the map. He was a big fan of Martha Gunn. He made sure she was looked after in her old age and gave her a sort of little stipend to keep her going when she got too old to go into the sea. And she was allowed to roam the kitchens of the Royal Pavilion, which wasn't far from where she lived, so she could go and help herself to the food in the royal kitchens there. So she's probably one of my favourite characters in the book, actually, Martha Gunn. I'd really like to go back and meet her. I think if I could go back in time and meet anyone from the channel, she'd be up near the top of the list, as long as she didn't throw me in the sea and dunk me under the water.
She'd be part of your fantasy dinner party, perhaps. She does sound like she's a fantastic character. Let's move along the coast there to Eastbourne, because one thing that really surprised me was Claude Debussy actually wrote La Mer not from his native Dieppe, which, you know, I imagine is, no offence to Eastbourne, but in my mind it's more romantic. But actually he was there in Eastbourne doing it.
It was, yeah. In the Grand Hotel on the front there. I mean, La Mer has always been one of my favourite bits of classical music, because I just love the sea anyway, whether it's the Channel or anywhere else. And La Mer is this beautiful evocation in 3 movements of different moods of the sea. And he certainly finished it off and wrote a big chunk of it in Eastbourne, which is probably the last place you'd expect for this incredible impressionist musical exploration of the sea. And he'd kind of, I think, he had quite an interesting personal life, Debussy, and he'd left his wife and run off with this other woman, and they'd crossed the Channel and holed up in this Grand Hotel in Eastbourne for a bit, and that's where he wrote La Mer. He had a room at the front. They can show you the exact room that he wrote it in, and he'd sit there and he'd look out at the English Channel and write these beautiful three movements of music about the sea. And he used to get fed up because it was a holiday resort, obviously, during the summer, and there'd be bands playing on the bandstand and kind of all sorts of musical performers, and he'd have to get up and kind of slam the window shut because it was putting him off. So yeah, I think he had a mixed relationship with Eastbourne, but it produced this incredible piece of music, and it's one of my favourites, certainly, and it was written in Eastbourne.
And we, as somebody who has a mixed relationship, that we not sent, but who chose to go to Debussy's home, Dieppe, was Oscar Wilde when he came out of prison, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Dieppe was probably my favourite place of all the places I went for the book. I could happily live in Dieppe. It's a beautiful town, and it's like a lot of seaside towns. It's got quite a lot of narrow streets coming back off the seafront to protect it from the gales coming off the river, and it's quite dimly lit at night. And you can really imagine Oscar Wilde kind of stalking the streets there as he because when he left prison, when after he'd been sent to prison at Reading Jail, and he was, he'd come out in disgrace, the first thing he did was travel to Newhaven and hop on the ferry over to Dieppe, where he had a couple of friends waiting for him. And in those days, you can still see it now, the ferry terminal, and in fact they were still using it up until the 2000s, I think. The ferry terminal was actually in the centre of the town. The ferry would come into the centre of the town. It wasn't like a separate jetty and port like it is now, and like most ports are. It was right at the heart of the town, because it was a really proper port town, Dieppe, then. And Oscar Wilde arrived in sort of the middle of the night and stepped off this ferry and was met by his friends, and he spent a good few months in Dieppe, and he had a mixed time of it, really, because he used the name Sebastian Melmoth as his alias, but obviously he's Oscar Wilde. He's fairly easy to spot at the best of times, and people sort of clocked who he was, and so he'd be shunned by kind of Dieppe society, or most of Dieppe society. There was a few people that would kind of hang around with him, and even to the extent that the cafes, and there's a great, beautiful cafe there called the Café des Tribunaux in the kind of heart of the old town, which is this big kind of crenellated Dutch building on its own little kind of piazza, and it's still there, and it's still kind of done out just as it was when Oscar Wilde would be there. This kind of fin de siècle, beautiful decor inside, and he'd often just be turned away from these cafes, and on one occasion, I don't think it was the Café des Tribunaux, but he went with three friends, and the manager scuttled to the door as they're about to come in and say, sorry, only got room for three people, not four. So he can't come in. You three can come in, he can't. So he had a bit of a mixed time of it, and then he ended up going up the coast a little bit further, and to a little village there, and then he was sort of unmasked there when he was throwing parties for local school children and things like that, and then he ended up in Paris eventually, which is where he died. So, but Dieppe is kind of you don't really associate it with Oscar Wilde, but it was a really important part of his story, certainly his later story, and quite a sad part of the story, really, because he was this flamboyant figure, very sociable, very gregarious, and his health had been quite badly affected by his time in prison. So it was a kind of really mixed time for him, but I think he enjoyed the anonymity he had at first, but then he kind of, his Oscar Wildeness kind of took over, and he was shunned by society. And there were a couple of really good friends that still looked after him, and would be seen with him in public, but there were few and far between, and it's kind of a sad story. But Dieppe did always attract artists and composers, and I think Rossini was in Dieppe. Walter Sickert moved to Dieppe, the artist, and did some great stuff there, painted some great stuff, because the light there is incredible. When you go up to the big chateau on the end of the promenade, and it's set quite high up, and you look down across the town, across the green, across the front, and the old town, and the light really is, there's a real sharpness to it, and a sort of almost a pinkish purple to it, especially when you get towards twilight, and it's really is responsible for part of the place's character, really. And there's nothing like it on this side of the channel, I don't think, that kind of really pure light, and it's all attracted artists and composers, and it didn't really attract Oscar Wilde. I don't think he had much choice, but certainly he spent some of his most significant time in Dieppe.
Let's talk now about crossing the channel, and we'll start with the channel swimmers. It has to be said that you have no ambition at all to want to swim the channel, but let's talk about some of the early people who did have mammoth ambition and actually either managed to do it or got really, really close.
Yeah. The first person to swim the channel, I think, is one that most people know, was a guy called Captain Matthew Webb, who swam the channel in 1875. He was the first to do it, and it was a hell of an achievement, because he was doing breaststroke, which no one swims the channel using breaststroke now. And as I say, that was in 1875. No one succeeded in swimming the channel again until 1911. Was the second time the channel was swum by a guy called Tom Burgess. But it's always something that's attracted really fascinating people, really kind of driven people, ambitious people swimming it for all sorts of reasons. And Matthew Webb, I think, just did it for the challenge, because he was a really gifted swimmer. He was a merchant seaman. He saved a guy at sea in the Atlantic. Sailor, they didn't save him, that was the thing. He went, this guy fell overboard, and Matthew Webb jumped in after him into the Atlantic in a storm. Couldn't find the guy, saw his hat, but the guy unfortunately drowned. But by the time the ship had turned around and come back, Matthew Webb had been in the water, and it was freezing in the North Atlantic, for about 45 minutes, and they pulled him out and he was fine. But he got a certain amount of celebrity when he got back for his heroism and even attempting to save this guy. And he just seemed to take the challenge of the channel, really, something really, he became obsessed with it. And he had one go and he didn't make it, but then on this day in 1875, he jumped off Admiralty Pier in Dover, accompanied by a ship captained by a very famous Dover pilot called George Toms, who would go on to pilot a lot of channel swimmers over the years. And it took him a very long time. The thing with swimming the channel is, when you look at it on the map, it looks like it's that far. And if you go in a straight line, it's 21 miles between Dover and Calais. But when you've got the wash of the tides in the channel going from east to west, west to east, it's impossible to do it in a straight line. So you can't do a 21-mile crossing of the channel by sea. You end up doing a kind of S shape. You're washed one way by the channel and then the other way, and then you come back and then you land. So they reckon that Matthew Webb and that first crossing swam something like 60 miles, and he drank, all he could drink was beer, and I think he had a boiled chicken fed to him at one point, and it was an incredible achievement, and it brought him this incredible fame. And he was still quite a young man at the time, and it was kind of an early example of celebrity really sort of not working out for somebody, because he was put on the music hall market. He was supposed to be talks and swimming demonstrations, but he wasn't actually a very sociable person. He wasn't very outgoing. He was quite shy, and his trick, as it were, his gimmick, the thing he was famous for, was stamina in the sea, swimming, and that's not very spectacular to look at. So it wasn't like he was a trick diver, or could swim with mermaids or anything like that. But he ended up kind of doing these really kind of tawdry challenges, and ended up very poor, and his mental health was really affected. And he'd swim in a tank on a stage in Westminster for a week or whatever, and people would come and watch, and it's not very exciting to watch. People would complain that it was fresh water, not salt water, that kind of thing. And he'd do these really terrible challenges in lakes in Lancashire. There was one he swam against a dentist from Tunbridge Wells, and it was awful kind of situation, really. And he ended up going to swim over the Niagara Falls, and it didn't work out. He drowned, unfortunately, still wearing the same red silk swimming trunks that he'd swum the channel in. So it was a really terrible end, but it did start this kind of great channel swimming craze eventually. I mean, the biggest times were sort of the 1920s, and one notable thing about channel swimming is doesn't seem to be any kind of gender advantage. Men and women both swim it, and they both swim it in the same kind of times. And in fact, probably the greatest channel swimming achievement was 2019. An American woman called Sarah Thomas, who'd recovered from breast cancer, and she swam the channel 4 ways. She went from England to France, France to England, England to France, France to England. And the Channel Swimming Association and the Channel Pilot and Swim Federation have really strict rules on swimming the channel. You can only wear a regular swimsuit. You can't wear like a wetsuit or anything like that. I don't think you can even wear gloves. You can wear a cap and you can have goggles, but otherwise it's just regular swimwear. You're not allowed to touch anything or be touched. Even if you accidentally knock against your support boat, that's it, end of swim. And the same thing applies even if you're going in more than one one leg. And Sarah Thomas did it 4 ways. And at the end of each leg, you're not allowed to leave the water. You can stand up on the shingle at each end, but you get 10 minutes to recover before you can go back the other way. And again, no one's allowed to touch you. You can't get a rub down. You can't be toweled off. No one can even give you a hug. And she did this thing in 4 directions, and it took, how long did it take her? It took about 3 days, I think, and she was in the water the whole time. And it's an incredible achievement. So like I say, it's men and women. It's completely gender neutral as an extreme challenge, and women are just as good at it as men. But yeah, one of my favorite channel swimming characters was a guy called Jabez Wolff, who is one of those great heroic failures. He tried to swim the channel 21 times, failed every time. I think he first tried it in about 1908, and he was still trying in the 1930s. And he was a hell of a character. And he's one of my favorite characters. In fact, I keep a picture of him over my desk, which I've got here. He was a huge fella. That's Jabez Wolff. I don't know what his medals are for. I don't know if he got medals for not swimming the channel, but I mean, my goodness, he gave it a really good go. 21 attempts, failed for different reasons. Often the tides were against him, and one time he got within about 800 yards of the shore at Calais, and the tide turned and pushed him back out again. And he was a great showman, a great storyteller. And there was one time he said a channel attempt was ruined by a submarine surfacing next to him, which would put the willies up anyone. He got butted by a shark at one point, which he thought wasn't very sporting on the side of the shark. But my favourite reason for him not swimming the channel was in the summer of 1914. He was going really well. He said that the glass was up, as in the weather was good, the sea was calm, he was making great progress. And then word came through that World War I had broken out. And so they had to turn around and go back again. So it was like fate was against Jabez Wolff swimming the channel. So he became one of the great swimming coaches and of channel swimmers, and he coached Gertrude Edel, the American woman who became the first woman to cross the channel in 1926, I think it was 25. Her first attempt, which failed, but they didn't really get on. He said she was more interested in playing her ukulele than training, and she was struggling in the attempt, and eventually he decided to heave her out the water because he thought she was drowning, because she was really really tired. And at the time she said he did the right thing, but then she got back to America and changed her mind, and there was this great war of words across the Atlantic between Jabez Wolff and Trudy Edel. And she came back the following year with a different coach, who was Tom Burgess, who was the second guy to swim the channel in 1911, and she succeeded. But he had these tremendous opinions about what made a good channel swimmer. He said, London girls, no good. He said, flighty, you London girl. You can't get them to bed before 9:30 in the evening, that's for sure. And he also was of the opinion that brunettes didn't have the sticking power to swim the channel. He was only interested in blonde women to swim the channel. And he coached a good fair few of them. I mean, fair play to him, because I mean he knew what to do in the channel. He didn't know what you do when you get to the other side. So I don't know how he coached them on that front, because he did it himself. But yeah, there are some terrific channel swimming characters, but I have no intention of emulating any of them. I'm happy to splash about for 20 minutes in the water every morning, but I don't look at France and think, if I just keep going, it doesn't look that far. No, that's not for me. That's for really incredible people who are dedicated, who have this incredible drive that I don't possess, to take on these big challenges. And hats off to them, from Matthew Webb in 1875 to the people that are doing it today. And there are kind of good couple of hundred people try it every year, and now people do it in relays as well. But I take my hat off to the individuals, and especially Sarah Thomas, the American woman who beat breast cancer and then swam 4 ways with just 10-minute break in between each leg. That's really something, and it's something I'm not ever likely to emulate, and don't particularly want to.
But there's much more in the book, actually, and we haven't necessarily got time to go into it now, that actually in some ways it's serendipitous that you are writing about channel swimmers, because Eltham and your local swimming baths where you grew up was a place where actually channel swimmers were trained, young kids particularly. And there's a wonderful memoir by Tom Gregory, who actually ended up being the youngest person, and he will stay the youngest person ever to swim the channel because the regulations changed. But we don't have time. That's all in the book. But what I want to talk about is within the book, you don't really tackle the controversial things about the channel as we look at them now. The refugees coming over, should we help them? Should we send them back? All that side of things. But what I loved about it was that you tell us stories from the past about when things were different. So the Belgian refugees who came into Folkestone. But one of the stories that really grabbed me was about the I don't know how you pronounce it, the Minettes, perhaps, as they were in France. Perhaps they became the Minettes in Dover. Tell us the story of that family and the difference that they made.
Yeah, they were Huguenot refugees, the Minettes, who came over at the end of the 17th century, when there was just incredible persecution of Protestants in France, and the Minettes were. They were quite a well-to-do family over there, but then the persecutions meant they kind of lost everything, basically. And they made this dramatic escape by boat, and they could have been killed. They had to leave Calais in disguise to try and get out and arrange it. And just arranging a boat to come and get them in those days, you couldn't pick up a mobile phone or send an email to anyone. So they had to kind of smuggle word out, and they had kind of family on the other side who were prepared to come and get them. And it's this incredible dramatic escape, and they're real parallels with the situation we see today. These people kind of escaping terrible things and hoping to find sanctuary on the other side. And I saw a boat arrive myself when I was out for a swim. When was it? In December, the last month, further down the beach. I mean, it was a really calm morning, and they obviously had a fairly safe crossing, thank goodness. But there was I counted about a dozen of them, maybe 12 to 15 people in an RIB boat that just kind of drifted ashore, and they walked up the beach. They all looked kind of well looked after and stuff. They had a good crossing, but that's been going on for centuries. It's not a new thing, and the Minettes were a great example of that. And they ended up being one of Dover's most successful families, and there's still evidence of what they did for Dover all over the town. They set up a bank, they set up a shipping company, and theirs is just one of the great refugee stories. And you could argue that Dover wouldn't be the town it became if it wasn't for the Minettes. Most people, the Huguenots, would head for London, or they'd have family in different parts of the country. Same with the refugees that come over now. They come over because they got the language. They come over because they got family here already, contacts here already. The Minettes didn't have any of that, so they kind of stayed put in Dover and made a life for themselves, and made a successful life for themselves over several generations. The third generation Minette, after Isaac Minette, who was the one that came over, ended up the mayor of Dover, which is an incredible story for over 3 generations. And the bank they founded, I think it went on to become part of the National Westminster Bank. I think the legacy is still there today of the Minette family, and there's memorials to them all over the town in Dover. And unfortunately, the big house they managed to build down by the port is gone. That's where the lorries come off the ferries now and straight up the motorway to London. They got flattened for that, but yeah, it's a hell of a story, the Minettes, and it's one I'd like to have explored more in the book, but I was kind of running out of space by then, because over the generations, theirs is one of the incredible refugee stories of all time. And so, yeah, one of my favourite refugee stories, as well as the kind of Belgian refugees that came over as well during the First World War. There's some incredible stories there that are really worth exploring and aren't really well enough known.
Absolutely. Charlie, as I say, it's a fantastic book. You've given us a glimpse of it. Let us peek below the waves a little bit, as it were. There's so many metaphors and corny jokes I could make. I'm not going to. The book, of course, is available, as all the books in the festival, at the Stamford's website. Do please go and have a look there. Thank you very much for being with us for what's been a really wonderful conversation. The book, it's got light and shade, it's got something for everybody. Wonderful stories, very well told. Thank you, Charlie, for being part of the Stamford's Festival.
Thanks, Julia.
A 10-minute break between crossings. I need a 10-minute breather after a few lengths of the local pool. Well, thank you, Charlie and Julia. And to catch your breath, let Debussy be the soothing, stirring soundtrack to your day, and Charlie Connelly's book, the reading material to bring the sea lapping into your front room. The Channel, the remarkable men and women who made it the most fascinating waterway in the world, is available to buy now at stanfords.co.uk.